Hi, everybody. Pastor Paul here. It's been a little bit of a while since I've done a podcast and been on social media because I've been in a writing project. You're going to see the results of that coming up down the line of a bunch of things. But it's made me think during this hiatus of a lot of things that I've been through over the last 2 years, and particularly some conversations that we've had on the Nonpartisan Evangelical podcast. And so I want to present one to you that was recorded pre-COVID. I mean, doesn't that seem like about a decade ago? So hard to believe. Pre-Black Lives Matter, ridiculous CRT arguments coming from the church. A conversation that challenged my view of race and color. And I've loved this conversation ever since with a woman named Ashley Rojas, who's a leader in our community in taking care of people. And I could say in the Latin culture of our city of Fresno, but I don't think that's necessarily a definition of it. I think she's somebody that's pushing to change things for everyone, and particularly doing it in communities of color in our city. I don't want to overdefine it because I want you to hear what she has to say. A big part of what I've wanted to do with the podcast is what I call proximity. I want to get people to have conversations or hear conversations from people that they don't know normally interact with in their life. And Ashley was one of those people for me. Not that I don't interact with people of color, but somebody that would say, hey, some of your views of race, even though I feel like I've made a lot of strides, she challenged me and said, why don't we rethink some things in our discussions these days? And it radically impacted my life. And I was thinking about this over the last couple of weeks, and I thought, I'm going to bring that podcast back. Now, I was nervous because we didn't do video of the podcast then, and we actually did it interviewing each other across a table rather than on the screen. So there's not going to be video of this one for those of you watching on YouTube. Those listening on Apple Podcasts, you'll never know the difference. But I think the conversation is so important. I hope you'll be okay that you can't see the conversation between Ashley Rojas and me, but that you'll listen, and you'll listen with an open heart, because I think it's a very important conversation, and it may be challenging for some of you. It may poke a little bit, kind of like when Jesus said, drink my flesh and eat my blood, drink my blood, eat my flesh with people. And a bunch of them said, we're out of here. This one may pinch a little bit, but it's so worth hearing. And this is such an amazing woman in our culture of our city today that I'm proud to know her. And so I hope you'll listen in to a really important conversation about race in America today. This is what I'm about, is challenging our mindsets and what we've believed. And I hope you'll let yourself be challenged today on the podcast. And even as you listen, let me remind you that God is not mad at you, and God is not mad at that person you think God should be mad at. Life can be very different if we see the world that way. Now, to this extraordinary conversation with Ashley Rojas. I hope you enjoyed the podcast from pastor-paul.com.
For those willing to listen, learn, and have eyes to see and ears to hear, this is the Nonpartisan Evangelical, where we're challenging the mindset of right-wing Christianity and encouraging people to have their minds renewed and hearts transformed. Let's have better conversations about the life modeled in the Bible, so we can truly tell the world God is not mad at you. This is the Nonpartisan Evangelical Podcast at npepodcast.com.
I always say I want to give proximity. I want to hear voices of people that they don't hear on a daily basis in their neighborhood, perhaps, or just in their daily conversation. And I was recently having a conversation with somebody, and it challenged me, made me think, and I thought, okay, that's a person I've got to get on the NPE podcast. So here she is, Ashley Rojas, who in her professional life is executive director of Fresno, Barrios, Unidos, and I hope my gringo use of that title is okay. And then is just a very wise person in her own life. And so welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah. So and just by your position professionally, we get the idea that you're working with communities that are different than maybe some of our white evangelical community know about or are very familiar with. And so even as we were getting prepared for the show, I was asking you, what is the proper way we speak of the community that you deal with and work with on a daily basis?
Yeah, and what I was sharing with you was the way that Fresno, Barrios, Unidos, and the way that I, in my professional work, talk about my community when asked, right, to describe them in a way that fits with public health models or even philanthropy, etc. We will talk about our community as a group of folks, often Black, Indigenous, people of color, who have been historically and systemically put at risk. And that's in place of, you might have heard folks say like at-risk youth or even, at-promise youth. But what we really want to acknowledge is that there are systemic and historical factors that have created the conditions in which our community live, and that there is no innate risk or flaw in those people.
So when we say at-risk youth, we're almost creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways?
Right. We're projecting onto them a deficit. And we're saying, and this is sort of gets into school systems will say a lot about like an academic achievement gap, but they won't talk about an expectation gap. Where do we expect the same level of success from all young people? Are we providing young people with equitable investments to reach the same goals? But instead, we'll just talk about sort of like the failure without acknowledging the inequity of investment from the community as a whole and not just the school system.
So let me ask a question, and I apologize ahead of time for sort of the ignorance and flippancy of this question, but I guess the question that a lot of people would ask in talking to somebody like you is, what's the problem? I think the people that are in sort of the white evangelical middle to upper middle class socioeconomic groups, I think they want everybody to be happy and healthy and taken care of and truly have a heart for that. But they just are kind of like, what's the deal? And it feels like we've done a lot and still we have the problems. And so can I ask very gently and lovingly, what's the problem and how do you define it for people that may not work with the groups that you work with?
That's a lot. I could talk for a while about this.
You can't answer that in 3 sentences or less. Huh?
No, what's the problem?
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, you'll hear folks say like lack of wealth distribution or, higher crime rates due to poverty and all of these things that are very much so documentable, issues. But what we don't often acknowledge, again, is the systemic and historical context that has curated communities like the one I'm from and which is the very one I serve. I grew up in Southeast. My mom was 15 when I was born, which, is a result of a whole set of circumstances. And my family still lives in the same community that I now have the privilege of serving. And so it really is much deeper than a single problem or even a single generation, that we have to actually understand the historical context that has created the, town, city, states, borders, policies, laws, regulations, and who were they created for, and for and by, and who was actually designed out of those things. And so I think it's really important to, step into our discomfort with a lot of love and tenderness, because it will be a painful journey for us all to honestly explore our history. Our shared history, and then the history that has been manufactured to uphold a certain ideology, and then the history from some of us that has been stolen. Mm-hmm.
So you're saying some heavy things there.
The problem is dense if you really want to unpack it.
Yeah.
I mean, we can keep doing things like, giving folks bus passes so that they, have transportation. But until we truly acknowledge the root cause of the wound in our shared community, and I don't just mean Fresno, I mean in our country, where's this wound coming from? It's like if you keep putting Band-Aids over a festering wound, it's not going to get better. It's going to start looking different. You might get a growth over it, but it's not going to be healed.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And that's why, and again, I'm sorry for the insensitivity of the question, but I'm trying to think of, as people are listening to this, sometimes this is where their mind sort of goes. And so what does that difficult conversation sound like? And part of what I'm doing, if you're listening here, and we have listeners from around the country. So one of the things that Ashley's talking about here is Southeast Fresno, Southwest Fresno are kind of known as the poorer areas of our town, while the people of more resource have moved north and north and north as the city boundaries have grown. And so we do have sort of this feel of, you have these left behind cultures that are struggling a little bit more. But I know even that language is not fair to the people that live in those neighborhoods that, like you said, you love the neighborhood. You wouldn't leave it. You just want to see more opportunity for
and
the people who live there.
Success for that neighborhood, for me, doesn't mean it looks like our neighborhoods in North Fresno.
Right.
It means it looks more like itself. It means it is as colorful and vibrant and multi-generational and multi-ethnic and collaborative as our communities are organically, with more sovereignty, with more resource, because it won't look the same because we are not the same.
So it's not necessarily just about getting a target to come into the neighborhood.
No.
Which will make everything all right if you can get a target in.
I would take a couple of grocery stores before a Target. Yeah.
And there is a dearth of all those things and healthcare places to go for healthcare and all of those things. And those are valuable and important.
Competent quality healthcare that values, again, the cultural orientation to wellness that our community carries. Again, it's when things are not designed with you in mind, that they don't cultivate the solution they're aiming to.
Wow. Tell me more about that. How do you see that happening, or how have you seen that happen?
I think there's a movement in health systems and public health, to acknowledge, culture. And this is something Fresno Barrios Unidos has done for a number of years in alliance with folks like the National Compadres Network and Sons and Brothers, and locally a group of elders under an organization named Integral Community Solutions Institute. All of these folks who have been doing this work for decades, since the 60s, like original movement leaders, reclaiming their identity as Chicanos, as Latinx people, as Black people, under these same systems, saying, we are not of European descent. We are not Western white people. Our culture is different. We have different ways of engagement, different family structures. And if a health system was never designed with me in mind, and my culture and my history and my norms and my nuances, then every time I go to get what I need from that system, I'm having to navigate hurdles that are there because it was not designed with me in mind.
So that's interesting. And maybe, and this sort of plays into a lot of the national narrative of things right now, that maybe we as white people need to understand that being us isn't necessarily American. That is not the whole definition of what is American. Is that a fair part of the conversation?
I think that being American is a whole conversation on its own. What does it mean to be American? Who is American? Who is America? These are all questions that I think are beyond deserving of conversation and so rich with depth that it's a little hard to find a place to start. But again...
So that looked like that was painful for you to think about that.
I thought about the doctrine of discovery. And even just the claim that you have arrived to a place and so now it's yours. my family has been on this land since as long as anybody can remember. I did 23andMe, and I think it's over 45% Native American. To native to the land that is now Mexico, Texas, and California. And so as far as my DNA tells me, I've always been on this land. And
You've lived here longer than I have.
And I don't think I fit like the American identity. Because America, or because I'm older than America. Because where I come from, the people I'm from are older than America.
So tell me, why does that bring pain for you? And I'm not saying that's a weakness at all. I just love to explore.
No,
I'm
really tender-hearted. And I've worked really hard to cultivate.
Well, I hope it's okay that I ask it. You can always tell me stop, Paul, at any time. I just love exploring this stuff because I think it's really important for us to hear it. And I don't think we've heard a voice like yours often enough.
I could point in the direction of a lot of brilliant people that I learn from every single day too. And it's because I'm choosing to learn, and I'm choosing to unlearn. And I think that that's a choice more people would benefit from making, is that I'm going to pursue my learning and unlearning and not just wait for it to find me. And so, it just reminds me.
And that's really all of our responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. That we have to continue to learn and unlearn and live in that place of malleability, because we are all sharing space, right? This is a team sport, no matter how we want to think of it. And so why it brings pain, I think because I have heard a lot of story. I also think because I carry wounds that have been passed down from generations of navigating this experience of dominance, right? Like, we're going to take this, it's ours, now it's this way, and this is the way to be, and this is professional, and this is not. And all of that rule setting, right, by folks who are new, it lives in my body in different ways. And the more I do my own healing work, the easier it is for me to feel into my community and into my generations. Like, when I talk to my grandmother and she tells me stories about boarding schools in Texas and about being punished for speaking her own language, that wounds me, because at a certain point, folks in my family and folks in families like mine stop speaking our language for safety.
Wow.
So we lose our culture to assimilate, and sometimes we reject our culture for assimilation and safety and access to resource. And then some of us become the ones harming each other the most. And it's all the complexity. It's the complexity of that whole experience that when I really take a moment to sit in it, it becomes really visceral, and I can feel it. Yeah.
So even, I would assume, a term like "Make America Great Again" doesn't sound like a very appetizing choice and possibility maybe for you.
I often just want to ask folks, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
What is your, tell me about your great America.
And what, do you get any answers to that?
I'll get a lot of really proud statements of, like, patriotism and, protection, and we're here to be hardworking people, and it's not often that I'll push too much further than that, because again, it's about, like, am I really willing to do this right now? Especially if it's in my personal life on my downtime, and it's something I don't get a lot of choices in terms of having this conversation or not. And sure, I made the choice that this is my work. It's not just my life, but in my life, right, I live this. And so other folks get to opt into learning about systemic oppression, about generational violence, about the impacts of genocide and human trafficking as the origins of a country. And some of us just live it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not often that I'll opt into a conversation to that degree. I mean, with friends of mine, yeah, we'll kick around a can all day. But somebody who I can feel is just deep in their pride, and I'm gonna make the choice to not invest my energy there.
Yeah. I call that the people with eyes to see and ears to hear, and if they just are shut down to anything, it's really kind of a waste of air and space to spend a lot of time talking about it.
Yeah, and so that I mentioned this to you earlier too, and so that I don't hurt myself with anger or frustration, I just try to have compassion for them.
Mm-hmm.
I really do, and not in a pitying way at all, but truly, how do I sit in my values and beliefs and cultivate compassion for somebody who is holding on to an ideology so firmly, and get curious about why they're holding on so tight to something. And whenever I've known people to hold on that tight to things, it's usually because they're afraid, or they don't want to feel like they don't know, because not knowing things is really destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just try to fall back into my work and, go do something that's good for me.
Yeah. And I think it is a lot that culture is changing. I mean, just the very easy to look around us and say, okay, the baby boomer generation is coming to its end. The millennial generation is I started to say ascending. I don't know if that's the right term. Is stepping into leadership roles. I was telling somebody this last week. Millennials aren't kids anymore. They have kids now.
I'm 30.
Yeah. And so just that is causing attention. And I think if you have people who aren't willing to learn and adapt and adjust, then it does become a sort of fight of victims saying, these people are trying to take something from us. And
parenting styles are shifting. I think my mom isn't a boomer. She was, again, 15 when I was born. So she's, I think she's
she'd be an Xer.
Yeah, she's Gen X.
Yeah.
But she's married to a boomer.
Okay.
And so and she didn't get married to him until I was about 15, which is a pretty tough time to try to step in and, assert authority for him anyway. And yeah, it was really complicated. He had this whole other way of parenting that was really dominant in space. Like, no, I'm older than you, and I said this, which I think is true to the culture of like boomer culture, is like, no, this is the rules. Number one, I didn't grow up like an average kid. I played parent to my little sister because my mom was at work, and I had to assume responsibility and be on the team. And so, we had a little bit of a culture clash.
There's a lot of that going around these days.
Yeah.
But I think what I enjoy about the conversation is I just think we need to hear the pain. And so I am sorry the question draws pain, but I think it's important to hear, and important. I think it's a really hard concept for even somebody like me, a Midwestern boy growing up and moved to California in college, that even the concept of what is American, and that in a lot of ways we sort of say you have to become us to be okay and appropriate, and in even that being a difficulty for somebody to hear, then if I'm living as a victim of, hey, everything's changing around me and I don't want it to change, then I become defensive and can't hear that. So in some ways, it's the conversations I'm trying to have with people is like, hey, let's lay down our defenses and start to hear why we're in this clash, why people are being hurt by what we do when our intention isn't to hurt, but it is, So
I just think a lot about just mortality and how much human beings, people resist, don't want to be adjacent to our own mortality, our own fragility. We'll intellectualize ourselves away from the fact that our bodies are primitive, they're simple, and they have an expiration date, and we don't get to be doing this forever.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I just, again, try to sit in my compassion with folks and like they're wrestling with like a generational shift. And I think folks are also wrestling with feeling their own mortality, which I think happens at every intersection of generations. There's a little bit of a power struggle. And I think that's also because as Americans, we don't center and celebrate our elders. They just sort of become obsolete. Right. We're obsessed with youth, with power, with strength, with ableness, right? Being able-bodied.
Right.
And once you don't have those things, you lose social or cultural value.
Yeah.
And so I wonder about that too. And in my community, right, our elders are sort of the center. Our elders and our littles, they're the heart. I canvass and I knock on my great grandmother's door and sit in bed with her for 20 minutes. And, that's what it's about.
Yeah. And if the two generations could really honor each other that way, that would take away a lot of the fear. And then it's this idea of, if I'm on the government dole, that's a negative thing. And our boomers in some ways are headed that way, and they're getting government health care and Social Security and all those things. And
that we will all need help at some point.
Yeah.
And if we were lucky enough to not need help when we were younger, hopefully we have the humility when we're older to settle into that help, because it's really challenging.
Hi, everyone. This is Paul. Thanks for letting me interrupt for just a moment. I want to tell you about something we have coming up that I think is going to be really cool. And it happens this Sunday, if you're listening to this before October 24th. October 24th, 5:30 Pacific, we're having a webinar that I've entitled, Jesus Was a Very, Very Bad Evangelical. I've had many of you asking me over the years, can you kind of tell us your story of deconstruction of your faith and the journey that you're walking on, and facilitate discussion on the topics around deconstruction? And we're going to do that. We're having a couple of cohorts called Deconstruction U, one online, one in person here locally in Central California. And it all kicks off with this webinar of Jesus, the very, very bad evangelical. If you go in my bio and click on the link tree, it'll take you to the place you can register. The webinar is absolutely free. And the cohorts that come after, these 5-week cohorts, that'll be 8 topics of discussion around deconstruction. There's a cost to them because I'm making a living spreading this message that God is not mad at you, but I hope you'll check it out. Let me invite you to join us for this webinar on Sunday, October 24th, 5:30 p.m., called Jesus is a Very, Very Bad Evangelical. And we talk about the fact that Jesus was the original deconstructing person of his faith. And we'll talk more about that. I hope you'll join me for what I think is going to be a really cool time to make sure that if we're walking out a deconstructing of our faith, that we're not doing it alone, and we're not doing it without support for that journey and challenge for that journey. So I hope you'll join us. The webinar is called Jesus is a Very, Very Bad Evangelical, a Deconstruction U webinar, and it happens Sunday, October 25th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific. I will see you there. Now, back to our intriguing, brilliant, and fun discussion with Ashley Rojas of Fresno, Barrios, Unidos on the Nonpartisan Evangelical Podcast at npepodcast.com. We have Ashley Rojas with us today. She's Executive Director professionally of Fresno, Barrios, Unidos, and personally just a super awesome person and a 30-year-old millennial, as we've learned now. And I love the other day I posted something on Facebook and you came on and pushed back, and I was talking about this idea of what if we lived in the radical middle, if we weren't totally beholden to either side of the political spectrum, but could take the best of everything. And I thought it was a really great concept, and you came in and pushed back on me. And so I thought that would be a fun conversation. So what was your pushback on my idea of the radical middle?
I think I said yes and.
Yes and.
I think that was
all
my
right.
pushback.
What's a gentle pushback?
And then I said I'd love to chat with you about this.
Yes.
And so I think the middle is a really, wholesome place to want to be, really honest. And I can hear folks wholeheartedly yearning for that place, because that place in a perfect world would be the place, right? Like right here where everybody fits. And with our current place in the way we're experiencing politics, and the extremism on both ends, certainly, but the extremism of our current presidential administration makes the middle a little bit of a cop-out.
Gotcha.
I really can see why people want to be there, and right now is not the moment, because some of us are dying because of this. And so it just makes the middle feel like a gut punch a little bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because I don't think saying like that I'm deserving of resource, I'm deserving of more than survival, I'm deserving of access to resources that truly don't belong to those who are hoarding them. I don't think that takes anything from folks who are on the right for reasons softer than the extremism of the current administration. And so I don't think you lose anything by siding with those of us who stand to lose a lot.
So to you, the middle is not standing with people that need people to stand with them.
Right.
In a season where, so tell me how are the people that, and again, I'm sorry, I don't know all that, but kind of the communities that you deal with, how are they experiencing the political atmosphere today? Because we've talked a little bit about that, you and I find the take on that interesting and important for people to know. Mm-hmm. And I know you don't want to get too political, and your job doesn't even allow you to get too political, but maybe just how that's experienced. You were telling me about that, and I found that interesting.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, and I'll just talk about one point. I mean, I could go at this from a couple different ways, but let's say like immigration, right? And everybody will say like Obama was doing it too, the rhetoric, right? Folks that are being like dog whistled to come out of the shadows, right? Like that and the psychological, right, trauma that then manifests physically into actual disease in my community. That's what I'm talking about, is that like this rhetoric, and this is, I think, what I try to get at with almost everything is that
sorry to interrupt, but the rhetoric being certain immigrants are less desirable.
They're coming to take from us. Yeah. They're sending their rapists and murderers. And then we have a mass shooting in Texas where somebody targets Latino people.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I'm talking about, is those are the dog whistles. And when you are reckless in leadership, there's a massive fallout. We support young people who, in our monthly healing circles, will say like, yeah, I don't even know if my mom, like sometimes I'm at school and I don't even know if she's going to be home when I get there.
Yeah.
Because Trump is threatening ICE raids. And our city isn't a sanctuary city, and our county is attempting to put Trump language into our county board of supervisors. You know what I mean? So it's like, if I'm worried that my mom won't be home, I probably don't really care about what I'm learning in class. And even if I can focus on it as a distraction, I'm having to battle this thing living in my body, my heart. And so that's sort of what I'm talking about is, it manifests differently. It's not just a political talking point. It's not just a debate. It's not just a strategy to win voters. Like, these are real lives. As a woman who has done work to heal from sexual abuse, my body is mine. I am sovereign. And to have administration that wants to take my sovereignty over my own body from me it's really triggering, and I have to step into my healing work again to reclaim myself and to not fall into the fear that is being triggered, and the powerlessness that I know when your body is not yours.
Yeah.
And so, all of these things are real.
Yeah. So I pastored a church for a long time that was mainly white and evangelical, and have certainly seen for me, the disconnect between what I read in the Bible and extreme right-wing politics. I don't actually see that they line up very well. You have to really stretch some of those verses to make it work. I have many good friends who love God and love people, and they totally disagree with me on that. But the thing that really got to me and has caused it sort of a change in us and in our household is that we thought most of that was benign, that it was off. It wasn't exactly where being Christ-like was, but it was fairly harmless. And hearing stories like yours where it's like, hey, this isn't harmless at all. Mm-hmm. This is extremely harmful to people who are American people. When we start to think of people as others, and we can dehumanize them and take skin off of them and make them something subhuman, we can do terrible things. Like, I live just a few blocks from where we put American citizens into camps because they looked Japanese, and we were afraid of Japanese people.
And we've been able to, as a country, engage with that narrative. Less so than we've been able to engage with the narrative of genocide and indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Governor Newsom was the first governor of California to acknowledge indigenous peoples of this land and to apologize for what happened. And apologies, right? Folks are like, so what if they're going to say sorry? And it's not about sorry, right? Yeah, that doesn't fix anything. But when you speak truth, we can start truly healing. Mm-hmm. But until then, it doesn't happen. And we struggle with that in a lot of ways. But the Japanese internment was something that we found our way back to in a pretty quick way. I'm sure Japanese people have a lot of feelings about that I don't share that experience. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's interesting to me sort of what we're willing to name and what we're not willing to.
I think it's a good example to look at, because I think we all do acknowledge that was really wrong. Mm-hmm. That the Joseph McCarthy communist congressional hearings were really wrong, and that's our capability as a people. And I think if we can start to tie that to, even now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they're looking at, thousands of Black people were killed and thrown into mass graves, and start to say these are atrocities akin to anything else that's happened in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. Then I think we can start to, again, get a little bit humbler in who we are as a people, and start to say, I mean, for me, when we start putting kids in cages at the border, we have to say, no, we have promised ourselves we would never go here again. And so that's why I try to kind of tie those things together.
Yeah, and there's a quote, I'm going to mess it up, but it's like, until the story is told, from the perspective of the lion, like the hunter will always be glorified, or however that quote goes. Yeah. But it's sort of how we tell American history. We tell it from the perspective of the European settler, right?
Right. And what that ultimately comes back to is people, we have to trace that back to, we won, we took it, and so it's ours. And now anybody else who says that doesn't work for me is now an enemy to our culture in some way. Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. But none of us really want to be the despotic conqueror.
No, and nobody wants to feel guilty or shame. And I've been trying to really sit with that, and
how do we? I'm looking for that language and how to be able to have that conversation with people before they get defensive. So
far, Mark Charles is the only person I've heard who can talk about white guilt and white shame and how it manifests in, belligerent rage at times, right? Like this, this avoidance of taking ownership, or like we hear the like white lives matter or all lives matter. There's nothing wrong with being white. And it's like, nobody's saying any of those things.
Right.
But what we are saying is that something happened here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the very basic in Fresno where we are is we have to acknowledge that at very least there were redlining laws that made sure that people of color couldn't go north of a particular barrier. That happened. It's documented. And even when it became illegal, it continued to happen for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And to be able to say, and ultimately what I try to say to my white conservative friends, that impacts the economy of all of us. You know, mm-hmm. if you want to put it into a conservative context, mm-hmm. until we can resolve those issues, Fresno can never be the city that it potentially could be. Mm-hmm. And so it's imperative for my well-being, which is a bad context to put it into, but sometimes you got to convince people there's a reason mm-hmm. other than just as humans we should care, and as Christians we're commanded to care from my perspective. Mm-hmm. But this is, we can't, there's some things that are just never going to get fixed until we do come to that reality and say, hey, part of the history that I've inherited mm-hmm. is my responsibility to revisit and bring healing to, so we can really see things change.
And to maybe not, or maybe what I'm trying to say is that the way that manifests is not in leadership, or leadership at the front anyway. Mm-hmm. That what it looks like to be helpful in amending this wound is listening, is deepening your learning, is facilitating the healing of those who have been impacted. I think, a lot of this like language can still feel like it's my job to save or rescue or elevate or lift these people, right? Still the othering. And so it's like, yes. Even
if you're doing it in a caring way, you're still.
Yeah. And because, again, we're not asking to be rescued. We're asking for equitable access to resources that have always belonged to us. And that the deficits not you, but that are perceived about us, right?
You can say you. It's okay. I'm learning too.
The deficits perceived about us are projections of your own mind. I have no deficits. I am wholly capable. I am wholly worthy. And it has been by design that I have been barred from access. And it is by design that I have been wounded in the ways that I have, right? And not just whiteness, capitalism, patriarchy. The depth of these and the interconnectedness of these things can't be denied either, because not only am I a person of color, Latina, I identify as a queer person, I identify as a queer woman. And so when you add in those layers, you start experiencing or noticing more, right?
Yeah. And we look at those and classify them not just as unique or wonderful in that we're all different and we have great things to offer to the culture together, which is the theory of what America is. Mm-hmm. But we start to identify those as negatives, mm-hmm. and or that this is good and this is bad.
Yeah, or outside the norm of what is acceptable.
Right.
Right, which is cis, hetero, capitalist patriarchy.
And what's so wrong with that, I guess? I mean, it's interesting because I did have a conversation with a friend this weekend, and I'm going to recommend he listen to this podcast. So he's probably listening right now as I say this. But his conversation with me was, at the end of the day, the economy is good, and that helps everybody. And, black unemployment is at an all-time low, as the president likes to say a lot. And mm-hmm. and so, again, it goes back to our original question. What's the problem? At the end of the day, why wouldn't I just vote my pocketbook mm-hmm. and everybody else's pocketbook? Mm-hmm. And I wish he wouldn't tweet. I wish he would quit tweeting. But these things are really harmful to people, and hearing that harm is really important in the midst of making our pocketbook decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's what's like the ROI? If that's where your money, if that's your priority, what do you get and what do you lose?
Yeah.
And what do we all lose? We lose brilliance. We lose culture, we lose flavor, we lose life, we lose so much vibrancy when we are whittled away, and only those that fit this mold can thrive here.
Wow.
We lose so much of each other.
Yeah.
And we hide so much of ourselves, and then we suffer. And then we see the health issues we see in our communities. I would also mention to your friend that substance use is at an all-time high, suicide, anxiety, depression, PTSD. Like, we are a country that is not well.
Yeah.
And so, is your pocketbook really what you're paying most attention to?
Yeah.
Because folks are in so much pain and unconsciously even, that we're harming ourselves and we're harming each other and we're destroying our planet.
And I wanted to bring this issue into it because even here locally, we had a mayoral election, and I know that, and even that, you know, a friend of ours told my wife, "Hey, the North Fresno church elects the mayor of Fresno." We all, and he just said it in a way of like, "That's a fact. We all know that." And I know that election was difficult for your community, and still to be decided as we're talking. We still don't know the outcome of the election, but so I'm trying to figure out how to keep this from out of
keep it nonpartisan.
Yeah, exactly. Good word. But the thing that was important, again, as you and I were talking about this, is like you had young people ready to ask questions at a mayoral forum, and then the Republican candidate refused to show up. Mm-hmm. And I think he even said didn't feel safe to show up at the event. And what does that mean to your group of people and the young people that you were working with in that?
It's a reminder that folks with power don't have to care about what you think. And that's where rage comes from. That's where a lot of, like, when you see people really angry, it's because we show up, we do our part, we engage in dialogue and discourse, we elevate our issues. And at the end,
you have to be really gentle to us, don't you?
And at the end of the day,
I can even feel you doing it today. So thank you for being gentle.
And at the end of the day, it's decided whether or not we're telling the truth, whether or not we're worthy of being accounted for, factored in, considered. And so it is a really frustrating process. And even before that, when we were doing Fresno was looking for their chief of police, Brand committed to doing a series of community listening sessions.
Our current mayor.
Mm-hmm. And, okay, law enforcement has the culture of law enforcement. And this is all by evidence of arrest rates. You can see that there's a racial disparity and that there is also a disparity in over-policing of certain communities and others, especially here in Fresno. What communities are considered dangerous and not. And so our young people are deeply impacted by this, personally, generationally, etc. And so what do? Show up to every listening session. Support young people to step into their healing so that they can speak truth about how they've been impacted and what they hope for our community. Whole hearts on the table. You said you're going to listen. Here we are. What happens? First of all, they publish a report that hard to read, doesn't tell a story. So we published a parallel report that was everything we heard our young people say in these meetings, everything our community asked for, things we demanded. They had made a commitment to integrate community voice. The last minute, again, because they can, they decided to bypass the process.
Yeah. So they put in an interim.
They put in somebody, and I've spoken with Chief Hall, and for me, this isn't about Chief Hall.
Right.
But he said, I didn't apply. I didn't want the job. And I don't really know why they put me in this position.
Oh, wow.
Right? He says, I think I'm figuring it out now, but I didn't get it. And I think, I have paying attention to what he's up to, and I have appreciation for some of the things he's done. And still then when that happened, they moved even the announcement of the new chief to a secured media room in a government building that we could not access. They locked us out of the process physically and like in every way possible. And so when our young people are like, hey, Miss Ashley, what the heck? And I have to sit in front of them and say, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
It happened again. I'm so sorry.
And how does that impact then the feeling of disenfranchisement for?
I told somebody, these are the moments where you get no justice, no peace.
Yeah.
This is when folks get so frustrated. This is why. Because we showed up, we did our thing. We showed up with less resource, in more pain, and we still showed up. And so to still be discounted, it just reinforces, right? And then that's why I don't get upset with people who, for their own sanity and well-being, have disengaged. I'm like a harm reductionist through and through. I will not ask you to do something that causes you deep pain. Without the supports and the network, and I don't have all the resources to take care of all of my folks to get everybody there. And so when folks disengage, I will sit with them in that and be like, I feel you. I sit in that too sometimes. There's a lot of days I don't want to show up.
And it's why when there's a flashpoint, then people start throwing bricks through windows. Mm-hmm. Because now it's bubbling over what has been contained inside painfully for a long time.
Mm-hmm. I've had to spend so much time and money learning how to facilitate my suffering in a way that people can hear, in a way that creates change, in a way that doesn't hurt myself or other people, and some people just don't have to do that. Yeah.
So I'm a big believer that the millennials are going to change this. That you see what, and I'm an Xer, so I'm just right on the border. So don't blame me. No, I'm kidding. And I'm certain of that. And I'm certain of that. There's something really special in your generation that's going to bring about this in a really amazing way. But what you told me is that's not good enough for today. Mm-hmm. That doesn't help today, does it?
Yeah, it's that folks don't get. I work in youth organizing, right? And a lot of folks are saying, it's the generation behind me. It's not even the millennials. Yeah. They're louder, they're fiercer, they're queer, they're less apologetic, all the things, right? And I'm like, and it doesn't absolve us of continuing to break down doors to make things less painful for them. Yeah. Because I will never ask for a young person to do something I wouldn't be willing to do. Right. I would never ask a young person to hold something that's too heavy for me. And so if I'm not going to be there holding it with them, I'm not going to ask them to do that, because I'm going to first wonder why I didn't pick up my part. And we can all do something. And so I believe that too. Yeah. Young people are incredible. And it's unjust to pass the baton just yet completely, but to in what we should be doing instead is making invitations to collaborate. Like if you don't have young people around your table in your strategy sessions, if you are not inviting critique from young people,
You said
you're part of the problem.
Somebody, what did you say? If you're over 40, you need to be mentored by somebody under 30?
Absolutely. And authentically as equals. Yeah. I think like we do a lot of like adultism, like, oh, you don't know, and how old are you, kid? Ha.
Right.
And I sit with young people that are so wise, so kind. I learn something from them every single day. So capable, hopeful, persistent, all the things, thoughtful, like critical thinkers who are like, hey, have you considered this? I'm like, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so all of that is why when you hear somebody say, it's good to be a moderate, what you hear is, hey, you're not coming to stand with me today with the people that are hurting.
Yeah. What I hear is, or what I think is, I'm glad you're comfortable.
Yeah.
So a lot of people aren't.
Well, it's not that comfortable a place to be today, but I love hearing that because, one of the things that happened in my life was reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. I remember it was New Year's Day, 2017, and it jumped off the page that he said, I'm most disappointed in the white moderates that keep telling us to wait for a better time.
And you keep saying you love me.
Yeah. And he said,
Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public.
So there is a demand on us.
You don't get to love me in the shadows. You don't get to love me when it's safe, because I don't have those privileges. Yeah. And so you show up in front of me and before me, and you knock down the people who I don't have access to. Because that's what it looks like to be an ally. Allyship isn't an ideology. To be an ally is a verb. You have to do it, and you have to do it daily, and you have to do it most urgently when you're feeling like you don't want to. So in that moment of like, oh, do I? Yeah, that's it. That's the moment. Yep, that's when you step forward. That's when you say the thing. That's when you say, hey man, I love you, but that's not cool.
Yeah. It's not okay. Yeah. And I think we're in that season a lot where that's being required of a lot of us. And for me, from a Christian perspective, it's biblical. It's if you don't care for the least of these, you're not a part of God's family. So that should be a driving force for us to begin with. And then the idea that our society will break down if we don't find a way to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots, or those that have access to resources, I think, as you were saying, and those that are not allowed or barred from having access to resources.
Yeah, and I think change is really painful for people. Yeah. Everybody has, again, every evolution or every shift in the way in which we engage with one another has been painful. And I think organically, we are built to avoid pain, right? Survival instincts kick in. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to. And to change means to step into unknowing, which again is unsettling.
And I think in American culture, we're even more geared toward pain avoidance at all costs. Because we have so much ability to buy medicine or binge on Netflix, or
we are so comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, do I want to sacrifice my comfort?
Yeah.
Right? That's a question that, when people say they're my ally, I will ask, what are you willing to surrender? Because you don't get to be here and keep everything you came with.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And change doesn't have to be like loss. I've been having this conversation with friends, but loss doesn't have to be negative. Like, I've been talking a lot with my friends about like loss is liberation.
Yeah.
Like when you lose things that don't fit anymore, you're freer to find the thing that does. And if we can all step into our discomfort towards liberation, imagine the things we will find if we put down the things that just don't fit anymore.
Yeah. Well, we were able to, I started a church 10 years ago, and we were able last year to hand the leadership of that church off to a young couple that's a little bit older than you. And it's been the absolute joy of our life to be able to see the next generation take this thing on and run. And so why can't loss be that? That we're giving other people from our resource to have something better than we had, I think it's amazing. And so I do encourage boomers and even our older indexers to start saying, how do I pass on a legacy? Because I cannot take this with me. So what am I going to do to sow into the next generation to see something greater than me come to be?
And there are so many important roles to be filled because we do need elders. I need people who have seen the last 3 decades, right? I need that. I need that guidance. I need that depth. And I need the invitation to learn from and to grow together. And I think it's just about like, can we reorganize? And can we see ourselves as still contributing and still being, leaders? Because I think that's a big thing is folks want to be at the front. And it's like, leadership looks like a lot of things.
Yeah.
And it's not always that.
I think you're not saying boomers get out of the way. And you're not saying white people go away and let everybody else take over. It's hey, let's join together and learn something new and figure these things out together.
Yeah, I'm saying I don't want anybody to be suffering.
Yeah.
I don't want anyone to be scared. Because I've been scared and it's painful and uncomfortable and no way to live. And can we all sort of hold hands together to work towards something that feels better for all of us? Yeah.
And it's a little hard sometimes. And now I know my friends are going to say, I knew it, Paul, you've become a liberal. But, when you see Michael Bloomberg spent $500,000 on an election campaign, and that's not even a dent in his wealth. I mean, we have the resource. The resource is available.
And I was just having this conversation a couple weeks ago at, Fresno, equity is the word. And a woman asked a question. I could tell it was coming from a place of fear. Like she was really worried that if we make this, and in her language, right, if we make this easier for them, what will they take from me? And I wasn't my best self that day. And I said, I'm going to push back on that because what you're discounting is everything it took to even get there. Right? And I think like we have to stop thinking about it as loss or as like us and them or we. And it's just, that whole framework is what's gotten us to where we are, right? This whole, like, I need to take as much as I can now, which is this fallacy of scarcity that capitalism necessitates so that we all keep striving, keep consuming, keep feeling like we don't have enough, so we keep playing the game.
Right.
When in reality, there's beyond enough. There's beyond enough. And nobody loses anything. In fact, most of us will get more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I really wish, and again, I asked myself this question, I asked it on my Facebook, is like, how do we hold those with power accountable? Because they get to opt into accountability.
Yeah.
Do I believe that you're deserving of holding me accountable? Do I believe you're capable? Do I want to, allow this?
Well, I think it's a fascinating conversation, and so thank you for teaching me and letting me learn from you, and be mentored by you through this conversation. And I do think, and I don't totally know what this looks like always, but I think my wife and I have some sort of bridge application in all of this to say to the generations, like, hey, let's figure this out together. But also I think it's important, and I do this a lot on the show, is just to say, in a lot of ways, we didn't know what we didn't know. Mm-hmm. And we haven't done this well for a long, long time. And so we're trying to learn now to do that better. And so just in representation of a whole people group of us, we're sorry. We're sorry. We just didn't know any better.
And that's why I showed up today.
Yeah.
Because I said, if that's where you are, I believe you.
Yeah. So,
and now we can do the healing work together.
I like it. And I think we do have a role to say to people like you that we approve of you and we are proud of you. And we're excited to see what you're going to do with Fresno and California and America, because it's going to be amazing.
Thank you. We're excited, and there's so much brilliance. And I think I want to name that, like, yeah, things are heavy for us. But what's incredible is that even so, we are vibrant and playful and alive and just so magnanimous anyway. Like, we shine so bright. And that's what I think it feels like to be in community, and to be in my community. It is the best tasting food. It is the best music. It is just liberated dancing and movement and play. And like, this is who we are.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. And I do love that, because that's empowered. And I was talking with somebody the other day about impoverished neighborhoods, and she's like, stop it. They're not impoverished. They're just not.
We are rich. We are rich beyond measure.
Yeah.
Rich in ways that I think Americans have been robbed of, which is connection, community, multi-generational living, like this whole, this way of being in community, that just doesn't exist in the suburbs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we are wealthy beyond measure, and we are all deserving of cultivating communities that feel better for everyone.
That's great. Thanks for listening to this podcast on the Nonpartisan Evangelical, npepodcast.com.